What if the biggest bottleneck to renewable energy isn't technology, but the materials supply chain we've outsourced? Welcome to Industry Ignited, the podcast where we explore the leaders, decisions, and innovations shaping the future of industry. I'm your host, Dr. 𝐌𝐢𝐤𝐤, and today I'm joined by Mike Reilly, founder and CEO of NextGen Materials. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Leanne. Very much appreciate being here.
You got it. Now, you've built companies across multiple industries, from infotech to materials. What's the through line in your career that led you to the critical materials space, and why now?
Well, through line through career really has been just an issue of, I love it when people throw out kind of these statements like this can't be done or this just can't be done profitably or something of that nature. And it just kind of gets my wheels spinning. That's what led to a previous company, 10X Networks, which was an innovator in rural wireless broadband when that didn't exist. And in all cases, it really starts with just trying to solve a problem and becoming more and more enmeshed in this is really some interesting stuff to dig into. And then, ideally, I usually keep an eye on, can I make any money on this? Because I'm a naturally curious person and I'm curious about all sorts of things that have no possibility of making money. And so I try not to spend too much time on those things. But in this particular case, it actually started with a very interesting conversation with a brilliant PhD who was talking to me about a very unique resource called 𝐌𝐢𝐤𝐤𝐞 and a really important critical material that's still kind of looming out there in the future called silicon carbide. And I didn't know what the heck 𝐌𝐢𝐤𝐤𝐞 was, nor did I know what silicon carbide was. And as I started digging into it, I was like, oh, wow, this is some really cool stuff. In part, though, I also wanted to exit the infotech business just because I was a bit disillusioned with it. I just seen too often that okay, if not mediocre technology, quite often can beat great technology if the okay technology has adequate money behind it. One of the advantages of a materials space is, it's a hard physical thing. And if you're in a scenario where you can find materials where there is going to be a demand versus supply imbalance, if there's far greater demand than supply, and you understand how to create supply, then you're not going to get rolled over by a better algorithm. Ultimately, it comes down to a physical thing coming out of the ground, going into a marketplace. So, that was probably part of my motivation, was not to just be, bowled over by someone who had more Silicon Valley VC money. But really, I'd say it was the curiosity about how the things are made and what stuff goes into the things is what started it. Now, 6 years ago, coming up on 6.5 now, there really wasn't a focus on critical materials. It wasn't really a thing yet, but the critical material that we were involved in happened to reside in a mine that also had ferrous oxide resources, essentially iron ore, and that caused me to start looking very early into lithium ferrous phosphate batteries before most people thought that would actually be a big thing. And that caused me to get involved with the lithium ferrous phosphate cell manufacturing company that wanted to raise $500 million to put together a cell manufacturing business. So I became involved in trying to help them raise that money. And in the process of helping them raise that money, learned an awful lot about LFP chemistries and really began to believe in LFP chemistries, and then started becoming more and more invested in the concept of, if we're going to make cells here, we need the materials that make that manufacturing process possible to be here as well.
Right. Okay. So I'm just hearing that you're really drawn to big, complex problems. And not only that, but I, see it as like a challenge. You're drawn to the challenge, and that you saw the need for the critical materials. And at what moment did you see that they were a national scale challenge worth dedicating your next chapter to?
Well, under the last administration, we had a tremendous amount of interest in the renewable energy space. And whether we're talking solar panels, solar glasses, mostly made in China, started to see the real need from a grid support standpoint for batteries. There's something called natural gas peaker plants that they're typically built in the $250 million range, and they literally fire up for just a couple of days a year. And it's all about, creating stability on the grid. And so then I started doing a deep dive on the grid, which is actually a fascinating entity. I mean, it's actually this living, breathing organism almost, and has a tremendous amount of complexities around it. And started to recognize that batteries in support of the grid, specifically initially in support of renewable energy, was going to be a very big thing. Obviously, I was interested in the EV space. Everybody's been excited about EVs, but I was less excited about them just by virtue of the fact that we live out west, and range anxiety is a big thing.
Hmm.
Big, really started following EVs as well, and essentially saw all this momentum for pulling battery cell manufacturing companies to the U.S. And I use the analogy, it's almost like, we woke up one day and decided the French have too much control over croissant bakeries, and we decided we wanted to have more croissant bakeries in the U.S., but never realized that croissant bakeries require specialized flour and sugar. So we basically said, great, we're going to pull this capability away from France to the U.S., and forgot about the fact that all the stuff that is used to make those things are still, in that other foreign country. And right now,
Right.
China dominates battery production, um, and but even more than they dominate battery production, they dominate battery materials. But even within that, they really dominate processing. So, for example, in lithium, maybe they have 20% of lithium resources there, but they have 67% of lithium resource processing. From a graphite standpoint, anode materials, synthetic graphite, 66%, anode materials, 93%. And we started to see, really subsequent to the Ukraine war, people realize that if you rely on a potential geopolitical adversary for something
Mm,
critical, you put yourself at a very specific disadvantage. So
right.
for years, a lot of people have not really paid attention to the fact that the EU gave more money to Russia for the natural gas and fuel that they were in need of, because without it, they had very cold winters, than they were able to give the Ukrainians in financial support. So ultimately, you find yourself in a situation where someone that you're not certain that they've got your best interests at heart actually has you, in a very precarious position by virtue of the control that they have over, this natural resource. And that's exactly where we found ourselves with critical materials. We're seeing it play out in a much bigger stage right now with REEs and so forth. But really, the vast majority of critical material processing still happens in China, which
Yeah.
means they have absolutely control as a pinch point. But as important to the conversation as the control is the fact that there's a tremendous amount of economic opportunity in taking something from a raw material and converting it to something that's actually more valued by the marketplace. And right now, that's fueling the Chinese economy. And there's all sorts of reasons that should be fueling local economies instead. So when you think about solving big problems, regional economic development's a big problem. Basically helping us take this next leap to true renewable energy integration into grid resources, which is critical. But so is some of the necessary technologies for the much safer and more modular nuclear technologies that are coming. All of those require infrastructure. The infrastructure is made up of things, and those things are made up of stuff. And I find stuff that is necessary to make those things a fascinating place to spend my time.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And like you said, bringing it back home where we have more control over not only the process, but the resources as well. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, you've worked from Salt Lake to Silicon Valley to New York or to New Jersey, and even helped scale a company from 900 million to 1.9 billion in revenue. What did those experiences teach you about building credibility in markets where trust is everything?
One of the things I learned early is if you can demonstrate the things that people consider to be almost impossible, people will start to trust you with the mundane. So, for example, the company we took from 900 million in sales to 1.86 billion in sales, they were a company that built very inexpensive PCs. And in the world of PCs, basically, if you had a 100-node network and one of those nodes went down, that meant you had one of your people who was not, productive at that point. So people were willing to take a risk on something that appeared to be less expensive, and maybe they would even be susceptible to competitors saying, "Oh, it's cheap stuff. It has to be cheap because it's less expensive." What we did there is we were attempting to be an actual server company, and people didn't trust our servers because whereas one PC going down, that one out of 100 workers were down, one server going down could mean that the entire network went down. So I came up with this concept called specialty servers, where we did more complex, interesting servers that other people weren't really attempting. And the goal was not so much to actually make that the business itself, but it was more, if we can do the very hard things that other people aren't even attempting and prove that we can do that, then the simple stuff you should be able to trust us for. And because of that, we actually became a much bigger player in networking, which was part of what fueled that growth, right?
Yeah,
So in
right.
the world of critical materials, for example, just speaking to lithium, right now it's generally considered that you can't pull lithium out of clays profitably and productively. We think we're about to prove different, to the benefit of a very large Fortune 50 company that has been stymied by the fact that they haven't been able to deliver lithium at the prices that make sense for the market, and the market considers that technical problem to be impossible to solve. Similarly, we believe we have the ability to solve problems with extracting from geothermal brines. Geothermal brines are more difficult, both because the chemistries are much more complex, but also because of the heat. Essentially, if you have a 200-degree Fahrenheit brine, a lot of our competitors, their technologies rely on certain absorption beads and things of that nature, and very high temperatures destroy the very substrate that is used to pull lithium from those brines. We are able to solve both the complex chemistries and solve the heat issues, right? But ultimately, if you can go and solve the problems that everybody else believes to be impossible, then it becomes much less of a challenge to convince them that it's probable that you can solve the more mundane things. So we quite often, my thought across multiple companies has been, go become involved in doing the semi-impossible. Actually, we did that kind of with a scenario with the broadband company. We had at one point the record for the longest wireless shot, where actually the curvature of the earth actually causes the problem, which you can't solve because that's a geography issue. But again, once you can say, we've solved this thing that people don't think can be solved, it becomes easier for someone to believe that maybe you can solve the things that are just more run of the mill.
Right. I had an earlier guest say impossible just means I'm possible, as if you break it down.
Okay. No,
I
I
thought
like
that was witty. I'm like, I love that. Yeah. But yeah, so it's like, and I've also heard that, if you can conceive of something, then it's possible. It's just a matter of figuring out the solution. So yeah.
It's that without a doubt, one of my favorite quotes is, whether you believe you can or you can't, either way, you're right.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Was that Henry Ford? Is that?
I honestly don't know, but
Okay.
probably it's attributed to all sorts of people.
Probably so. Exactly. So you've been describing a model of innovating or processing and partnering with major players. Why is that approach strategically smarter in this industry with lithium?
So ultimately, figuring out alignment with multiple entities' goals, especially if those entities, have more market position or money or whatever, is important, right? The United States has a goal to pull materials processing away from China, and we need to. Venture capitalists have a goal for people to go and become the Amazon of critical materials processing, because that's how they achieve the greatest return on their investment. Amazon was a company that lost money for 15 of 20 years because scaling's hard. Okay. Our methodologies are focused on, how do we take advantage of existing technical and commercial processes that can be tweaked to solve this imbalance issue. And in doing that, we have the potential to scale much more quickly. So for example, in the case of lithium, our methodologies start with a chlor-alkali process, which produces caustic soda, which is a $500 per ton resource. For example, Tata Chemicals makes about 400,000 tons of that per year, so about 200 million in revenue. And just this week, lithium jumped back up to $20,000 a ton. That means $10,000 tons of lithium would generate the same amount of revenue as 400,000 tons of caustic soda. So given that the methodologies are similar, to me, I'd rather scale. Well, I'm not good at scale. Scale means hiring hundreds of employees and dealing with OSHA and understanding all sorts of things that are just out of the things that make me want to wake up in the morning. Okay.
Right.
So I'd much rather take our technology and inject it into somebody that already understands scale. But in doing so, we have to make sure that by adopting what we're doing, they're going to make more money or augment the money that they're making by virtue of becoming involved with us, as opposed to us having to figure out how to grow to be the the size of a Tata or a Dow or something of that nature. It makes much more sense for us to find people that are already in that space that we can essentially co-opt what they're good at by bringing our innovation and technology. And that could actually get us to the point that we can be competing with China in 2 years instead of
Yeah.
10 years.
Okay. No, that makes sense. So someone who's already in the space, who's already invested, has resources and relationships and connections.
Yeah, if you think about it, typically, what happens is you go from a seed to a Series A to a Series B to a Series C and so forth. A lot of that has to do with creating kind of the capital acceleration that allows you to get to that next level, right? So
Mm-hmm.
company has to grow and become big enough that a bank takes them seriously. If you're
Yeah.
dealing with a multi-billion-dollar organization, the banks are already falling all over themselves to loan them money. So, getting that next level of capital is not an issue for them. But for small
Mm-hmm.
companies, banks are very risk averse and they don't want to loan money to small companies that are growing. So it's a much faster way to get to scale. Now, the other
Yeah.
advantage we have is, unlike a lot of our competitors in individual verticals, we won't make all of our money in one thing. So we don't have to figure out how to become a $300 million company in lithium because we're going to do really great things in graphite and probably in copper concentration and hopefully magnesium metal and antimony augmentation. We have a lot of different tools in the toolkit that we can bring to market, which means we don't have to shoot for a bases are loaded grand slam home run. We can hit a lot of doubles and triples and do quite fine.
Yeah. Right. With that diversification. Yeah. Now, your three mantras include: first, supply demand imbalance and leverage; second, compete with China without relying on tariffs; and third, be more eco-ethical than anything else in the market. Which of those is hardest to execute, and how are you proving it?
Probably the eco-ethical part is the hardest, only because the expectations are very high there. Okay, rhetoric is easy, engineering is hard. Okay, so essentially what happens quite often is we run into people that initially are very supportive of what we're doing because it's better than what's out there. Okay, but they lose sight of the fact that our promise is to do better when they start saying, well, we want it to be perfect. We want this to use no energy and provide no waste and et cetera, right?
Yeah.
In the minds of the people that are very ecologically focused, they have this ideal of what this should look like, and they want it to be perfect. And interestingly, the minute I say, if you truly want that, then you really need to throw away your iPhone right now. And if you are driving a Tesla, you need to throw that away. And basically, you need to start walking and maybe consider becoming Amish, because if you are being pulled by horses, you are truly eco-ethical, right?
Right.
However, it's very easy to demand perfection of someone else while ignoring the accommodations that you're making in your lifestyle for people that are doing really bad things. I mean, Apple absolutely knew that they were using cobalt that was being sourced badly. Okay. But until it became really widely trumpeted, they were less concerned, because essentially at that point the CFO was making the decisions, and only later did the marketing department say, hey, we're getting a black eye here. We better figure out how to do this better, right? All of them are hard, but I would say that one's the hardest only because you deal with unrealistic expectations of people who don't even want to be convinced that their expectations are unrealistic. And
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, if we're doing better than anybody else in the marketplace, and we're delivering those things to the market, well, then we're doing better than anybody else in the marketplace. Please don't hold me to perfect.
Right. Yeah. So perfect isn't the goal, better is the goal. But in a world where sustainability messaging can outrun science, what does eco-ethical actually mean at NextGen? And how do you keep it grounded in reality?
Again, you got to look at what's out there in the marketplace in reality. I'll give you a perfect example. People are really excited about critical materials from recycling. Okay. That basically means at some point we turn the batteries from our Teslas back in, and we start getting more and more of our tech resources from that critical materials, right? The recycling industry is probably one of the most abused by industry's entities out there, right? People had been led to believe, for example, that we recycle 50% of our plastics. And believe it or not, the entities most likely for promoting that were actually the petroleum companies that wanted people to believe that so that people didn't fight petroleum companies on making more and more plastic.
Mm,
Reality is 3%. So
right.
we basically recycle almost no plastic. But the reason why that narrative has been pushed is the petrochemical companies that basically want to sell those PHA precursors that create those plastic bottles. If the market believes that it's okay to drink those plastic bottles because 50% of them are being recycled, then that's a great narrative to promote, right?
Right. It's all perception. Yep.
So we look at, for example, in the battery material space, I doubt that battery materials from recycling will be even 50% of the market 10 years from now. And that's because we keep finding better ways to use the batteries. Recognize that an EV battery is considered to be depleted when it only delivers 80% of its initial charge values. Okay.
Wow.
Well, you can do a lot of things with those batteries. You can use them. There's something called behind the meter, which is you put your batteries behind your meter and you actually download power when power is cheap, like at 2 o'clock in the morning. And then when there's a surge, you know that you have plenty available. In many cases, you can actually sell that power back to the grid at a higher value. So if I can buy something for, 3 cents at 2 a.m. and sell it back to the grid at 8 cents, that's a decent business. And batteries, a 75% battery is more than adequate for something like that. So we see a lot of hope and hype around recycling. I tend not to really rail against it because people don't want to hear it. But the reality is we're going to need to continue to pull battery materials out of the ground for quite some time because the economics of recycling just don't make sense yet, right? So, again, ultimately, it's looking at the reality versus the hype and then basically setting a benchmark. Now, if, for example, it turns out that we can make an awful lot of money also doing horrible things to the environment, that's just something we're going to take a pass on. We have enough other areas that we think we can innovate in where we can do all of the things that we intend, that if we won't be one of those organizations that says everybody else is doing it, so we can do it too. If we can't do good and do better, then we'll just take a pass on it and find something else to go become involved.
You described lithium extraction as either serially removing what isn't lithium versus plucking lithium directly from solution. What's the business impact of that shift on cost, time, water, and some scalability?
So without coming across as being negative about what I call DLE 1.0 technologies, the goals that DLE 1.0 set out to solve, they solved, and they did a good job of it. But a lot of times what happens is once you see someone build something not quite right, you're able to say, I wonder if they went about that wrong, right? So essentially in lithium extraction, the way it's worked for literally over a millennia, I don't know how long, maybe several millennia, is you have these ponds and you basically push the brine into the pond and then you kind of add some certain reagents that cause certain things to fall out, leaving behind more of what you're hoping for. And this is not just for lithium, it could be iodine, it could be a number of other things. And then you take that somewhat depleted brine and you push that into a different pond and you create a different set of reactions that cause more of a different kind of thing that you don't want in it to fall out. And essentially what happens is you end up with more concentrated lithium by virtue of going through a sequence of getting rid of the stuff that isn't lithium. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And the problem with evaporative ponds is it takes an awful lot of time, which is bad for market dynamics. But also it's incredibly wasteful of water in certain areas that cannot afford the water. So if you take a look at the salars of the high desert of South America, Salar de Atacama in Chile, the Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia, multiple salars in Argentina. The reason they work so well with evaporative ponds is the solar load is much, much higher. So for example, when people come out here to Salt Lake City to ski, I have to let them know that this is different than being at sea level because you have an awful lot less atmosphere between you and the sun and you end up with just stronger sun, right? And stronger sun is really good for evaporation. Well, the problem is some of these areas are among the driest in the earth. The Salar de Atacama is actually the second driest place on Earth
Mm.
from a precipitation standpoint. Only Antarctica has less precipitation. So if we have lots and lots of water that's being evaporated to make this stuff, and they don't get water other than through runoff and so forth, then basically using lots and lots of water to make lithium is a bad idea. And DLE 1.0 did a good job of that. Okay, they basically reduced the amount of water from 1,000 tons of water per ton of lithium to somewhere in the 20 to 50 tons of water per ton of lithium.
Mm-hmm.
But by doing that process, it's still, it shortened the timeline, and it basically allowed us to use less water, but most of them are electrochemical processes. The chemistry creates a lot of harsh effluent, bad stuff that runs off. And so you trade one problem for another. I would still argue DLE 1.0 is better than evaporated ponds, no matter how you slice it. But with our methodology, we essentially just pluck the lithium from the resource. So instead of basically reducing the amount of what is not lithium, we simply pull lithium out of the resource, which means whatever you started with, what you end up with is that same resource with just less lithium in it, which is far more environmentally benign. Okay.
Yeah.
And fortunately for us, it turned out that ends up being a relatively low power solution as well, and uses almost no fresh water. So we will be advertising that we will probably use 1 ton of fresh water per 10 tons of lithium. And probably the best DLE 1.0 solution might use 20 tons of water per 1 ton of lithium. So we're 1/200th as consumptive of water.
Wow. And what about time-wise? Is it a faster process?
It's a faster process because most of the other processes are batch processes. So you basically pour something into a column and essentially have the lithium stick to things, and then you have to kind of switch things out, and then you pour your hydrochloric acid with water wash bath into that column. It flushes off the lithium, and so it's not really continuous. Ours is a continuous flow process, which is patent pending.
Oh, wow. Exciting. So you also referenced synthetic graphite and the economics of competing with China, even when they sell at a loss to maintain share. What's your strategy for winning in markets where the competitor can subsidize indefinitely?
Well, we hope that people are smart enough to recognize that if things are truly critical, we just can't afford to buy it from a geopolitical adversary. I think in the current environment, we're seeing that. But in this particular case, in the case of graphite, we have a methodology that leverages another technology that uses coal and coal fines and essentially consumes those and creates very high quality, near green diesel. That's a high energy diesel, high quality methane, synthetic methane that can be used in a number of applications, including providing inexpensive power. And typically that hard carbon input, after it had basically taken all of the value of that specific energy, would have a hard carbon residue, which was metallurgical coke. And that metallurgical coke typically sells in the $250 per ton range. China probably produces synthetic graphite in the $600 per ton range and sells it as low as a $550. So they'll take a loss on it just to control the marketplace. And U.S. synthetic graphite is about $1,000 a ton. We'll be much closer to a met coke cost than to a synthetic graphite cost. So we're highly confident that initially, without any support from anybody else, we can just be competitive in that marketplace, even when China is selling below costs. Now, if it ever gets to the point that China decides to basically push the price down even below that, then we may have to go to, the federal government and say, graphite's critical and we need some assistance. But in the short term, we don't. In the short term, we should be able to be essentially natively competitive.
Right. No, that's awesome. Now, you mentioned aligned capital as a critical factor, capital that isn't handcuffed by VC expectations and can still win even if outcomes look different than a standard startup exit. What does aligned capital look like, and how should founders think about it in an industrial innovation?
I want to be careful about being too mean to VCs. VCs make sense for certain business models, but certainly not ours. Okay. A VC has an obligation to their LPs. They have to do a certain return, and that return is purely a return on the invested capital. Then on top of that, you have the fact that a lot of VCs have relatively high cost structures. And as a result of that, that means they have to have a really high return. The point is, if I get a company that puts $1 million into our company at, let's say for the sake of argument, a $30 million valuation, and their hope is that we actually turn that money into 5x. Okay, that means I have to exit at $150 million valuation to get their expected return. But if instead that company is someone that is really looking to solve supply chain issues, and those supply chain issues have tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of business impact, then basically the probability is that they're far more concerned with what we do as a business in terms of how it impacts their business than the direct impact of the invested capital. So in a lot of cases, you'll find companies that have business development funds, market development funds, VC arms. And the advantage of those is their expectations are different than a true return on invested capital scenario. Okay. Now, also, if you take a look at family offices, okay, a family office, obviously they'd love to see 5x return on their investment as well. But what they're for the most part looking for, especially some of the older family offices in Europe, is we want to outperform the market, and we want to do good. So if the market is at 11% IRR and we're at 12.5% IRR, but we're actually making sure that the bad things that are happening in the Congo or happening in South America aren't happening any longer, we're good with that. Okay. And it's a lot easier to deliver on a 12.5% IRR expectation than a 5x return on invested capital expectation.
Of course, right. Okay, interesting. Policy and geopolitics are shaping this space fast. From the grid's modernization needs to shifting supply chain strategies, what do you see as the biggest opportunity and the biggest risk over the next 5 to 10 years?
If I were 20 years younger, I would be focusing on everything grid. We have a massive grid infrastructure upgrade coming ahead of us. We have this grid that is, it is as critical to our nation's economy as our heartbeat is to our bodies. Okay. When the grid goes down, it's amazing how close the grid has come to going down multiple times. When the grid goes down, we've got that impact everything. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
The grid is probably 70% running on 50-year-old technology. Transformers today are built the same way they were 100 years ago. And essentially it's because we've been able to get by. Now, by virtue of the fact that we have this problem, and there's a great book called The Grid, it's really well worth reading. But we have this problem that we keep creating more people, and every version of a people wants slightly more energy than the last version of people. So our energy demand just continues to grow. And the generation of power and the transmission of power are about to undergo significant changes. There is so much potential to innovate in space and so much money to be made and so many smart people that are going to do so many cool things. It's just a fun and interesting space to be involved in. And it's a hyper growth industry for the next 25 years, no question in my mind. And, obviously the stuff that makes the things that are going to make the grid better is area. But there's all sorts of areas to innovate that are going to make a difference in the next generation.
Yeah, no, I see that. There's certainly a lot of opportunity there, and the need there is tremendous. Here in Texas alone, we, in the last few years have experienced, the grid growing down for a while, and that's not fun. And with AI coming on.
A really cool story. So, for example, in the past, you had these things called peaker plants, and they are gas-fired peaker plants that essentially, when a peak load hit, they would fire up and come up almost immediately, and they supplement base load, and that's what kept the grid from freezing, which didn't work all the time. It's interesting, and I want to say it was 2 years ago, they had put one of the first big BESS systems in place, I want to say like early January. And BES stands for battery electric storage systems. And they essentially replace peaker plants at a fraction of the cost. They're still expensive, but they're a fraction of the cost. 11 days later, there was a brownout that would have taken down the grid if that
Wow.
installation had not been live. It paid for itself in 11 days.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. No, I'm excited to see the innovation and development in solving the problems around the grid. Definitely. Now, you said something powerful. You're willing to urge people to become your competition because the problem is so big. If a smart, ambitious 30-year-old were listening right now, where should they look for opportunities to build, innovate, and make a meaningful dent?
Well, I think you start with what you're good at, right? I mean, if you're a software developer, then, don't necessarily try to become a physical chemist, okay? But if you're a software developer and you're working on the next great dog walking app where your business proposition is, hey, if people are wealthy enough to afford a dog walker, then we can sell them other cool stuff. So let's build a better dog walking app, okay? I would argue maybe something that if you look at the problems that we have with power, part of it is we don't generate enough power, but another area is a lot of the technology that's out there, both in the transmission subset and in the consumption subset, wastes a lot of power. So are
Right.
there to build software tools that are better at detecting, wasted power? Are there designs that can be implemented between hardware and software that actually create those better power solutions? I read something about a company just recently. They invented this very tiny chip that sits right beneath an NVIDIA chip that essentially doesn't convert the power until the last possible micro leap, because anytime I convert power and then transmit power, I have power loss.
Mm-hmm.
So if the space between power conversion and power consumption is smaller, then you're going to have less power loss, right? But the grid upgrade is considered to be likely to be somewhere between about a $7 trillion and $25 trillion problem.
Wow.
Okay. I will be likely dead before we're finished with fixing all of this. Okay. And basically, if we get a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of solving that problem, then we're satisfied. So no, find areas to compete in understanding what is it going to take for us to truly change the way that we power our our consumer and business and industrial marketplaces, right? Because there's a tremendous amount of money to be made, and it's really hard to improve something that's 99% efficient, but there's massive areas of the grid that are 50% efficient. Actually, that's one of the big issues with coal-fired power plants. Technically, when you take a look at the specific energy of coal and the amount of power that actually reaches the end user, we throw away 70% of the specific energy of coal. There's a better way to use something like coal. Coal's not the problem; how we use it is, right?
Right. Yeah.
So ultimately, if there's room for efficiency gains, then there's room for you to take your cut of the efficiency gain that you've created. And we don't need more dog walking apps. We have plenty of silly applications that are running on our phones that are annoying the hell out of all of us. And the reality is, what we really need to do is figure out how to make energy more abundant, accessible, and inexpensive. And there's a tremendous amount of money to be made for people who want to innovate in that space. And that could be, physical chemists, that could be software engineers, that could be electromechanical engineers, that could be, so many different, being in the HR industry, I would be specializing in training industrial electrical engineers because there's nowhere near enough of them. And so basically, if you can figure out how to get people who have been displaced by AI, live human beings are going to be out there connecting stuff to the grid and probably
Mm-hmm.
making $80,000 to $400,000 a year, depending on what subset they're doing. So there's a lot of potential in this space for people to be involved in and innovative and make great money.
Yeah. No, it's super exciting. I love that. I love the energy and the positive outlook on all of that, and just hearing about your thoughts on where opportunity can be found. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the
So
opportunity.
yeah, absolutely, and thank you for bringing clarity to a part of the energy transition most people don't understand until it's too late: materials processing and supply chain control. Now, for listeners who want to learn more about next gen materials or follow your work, explore partnerships, where should they go?
Well, my LinkedIn profile is probably a good place to start. I'll send that to you. I know you have it already, and my apologies, I don't have it memorized. We're updating the websites, but yes, please, if you have something specific to critical materials processing, I'm interested. If you are basically going to tell me, hey, critical materials processors need insurance, or they need shipping, or they need better SEO, please, I just don't have the time to respond to those. Those aren't our critical issues. But if you have something that is specific to solving a critical material processing issue, I'm very interested in collaborating and working.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Mike. And to everyone listening, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share it with a leader in energy, manufacturing, or infrastructure. And please tune in to the next episode of Industry Ignited. Until next time, stay bold, stay curious, and keep igniting industry.